Welcome to the Medical Insider Podcast, where we highlight real-life solutions to your health challenges, incorporate new technology and proven solutions from the past with a healthy dose of common sense, while resisting the pitfalls of idiopathic classifications and economically based medical doctrine. This is your host, Dr. Thomas Santucci. Let's get started. Good morning. This is Dr. Santucci. On today's podcast, we have a special guest, Erin Meldrum from NewMind, and we're going to be talking about brain scans and neurofeedback. So the big question is, what's a QEEG? And originally, I made a little picture of a Martian and figured out that was a cube, and that's what most people think. But it goes way, way, way beyond that. So one of the things that I thought I'd do is just do a little beginning, and it's a Wikipedia-ish kind of thing to say what we're talking about here. And what we're talking about is quantified electroencephalography. And so QEEG, it's a procedure that processes the recorded EEG activity from a multi-electrode recording using a computer. And EEGs, for those of you who don't know, is that the lines that go across the page like this, and there's a dozen or so, and it takes a genius to read them. We were trying to interpret those, and then we found technology that Erin's company developed and that is in the QEEG world with the so-called brain scans and the neurofeedback. And it not only simplified it, it made it so that we could attach the functional neurology to an actual map of the brain. And, you know, in neurology, if you know where a problem is, you probably have a chance of fixing it. So continuing, the processed EEG is commonly converted into color maps of a brain functioning called brain maps. And some of you have seen those. The EEG and the derived QEEG information can be interpreted and used by experts as a clinical tool to evaluate brain function and to track changes in brain due to various interventions such as neurofeedback or medication, which means you can actually tell where you are, where you're going, are you achieving your goals. I received my initial training in electrodiagnosis that explained the delta, theta, alpha, and beta waves, how to scan for them, and later how to alter into patterns most commonly associated with normal or optimal functions, as well as pathology. In those days, I thought the hardest thing in the world was to pick a protocol and frequencies to improve another person's brainwave. Erin was the guy that first gave me my first real understanding of regulating brainwaves and helped me obtain what turned out to be a pretty clear set of tools for intervening in neurocognitive disorders. So welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Santucci.
Erin's a technical guy, so we're going to bear with him and he's going to bear with us because he has a level of detail that is mind-boggling sometimes, but he's also the only one that kind of made any sense of it. You know, when you go to a new company and you're training them and you're telling them about this technology, what do you say it's for?
I say it's for just a process to look at, you know, what is going on in the brain. So we know basically we have norm data that shows us, you know, what an average brain should look like as far as electrical activity. So what we're doing is just looking at brain activity and comparing it to that normed out set, and then finding out what's irregular, what's normal. And then from there, the whole process can help to just kind of redirect or coach the brain back into a more normal state. And when that happens, we generally see symptoms start to alleviate, health improve, and the person getting back on the right track.
Great. So one of the things that people want to know is how accurate is the electrical signaling that we're getting on the outside of the scalp to what's actually going on in the brain? Are we recording everything that's going on in the brain or just a little bit of it?
We're recording surface activity that we can read at, you know, the skin level. Granted, there is a lot going on in the brain. Of course, you know, we've got the brain producing hormones and multitude of other things going on. But with measuring that surface activity, you know, we can get an idea of not only what we would call magnitude or power. So you can think of that like the volume of your stereo. And then in that volume, we're also looking at different frequency ranges. So you can think of that like a radio station. So We're kind of looking at each individual station. How loud is it? How soft is it? And then just trying to normalize that and bring it back to a level that is easy to listen to,
Right.
and
So it turned into a vernacular for us that was delta, theta, alpha, and beta waves. And where, delta waves, we would characterize, all these things can be said in a much more complex way, but we basically had them as sleep waves. And then the theta waves we had as deep emotions, alpha waves we had as what we were doing now, kind of just easy having a conversation, but we're alert, like living our life. And then beta waves is like intense study or whatever. And then gamma waves, which we don't really talk about, but that might be clairvoyance. That's the next level beyond what anybody's measuring. And the amazing thing about the technology to me was, being a functional neurologist, is, if we look at electrical impulses within the brain, you have the invaginations of the brain, and it's the only signals that we can actually measure, the ones that escape the 3 levels of the meninges inside the skull, and then the skin on top of it. And then we're putting diodes on top of that with some goop and measuring that. So it's pretty spectacular technology that takes these tiny little signals and then blows them up. And none of it would be worth anything unless you had some huge database to compare them to. So can you talk a little bit about that? How old's the database? Who owns it? What's going on with that?
Yeah, so the database we use was designed by Dr. Richard Suter, pioneer in the field of neurofeedback. He's been in the field for decades now. And that database was started with what we call just normed values. So we've got in normed values well over 1,000 of normed out brain activity, all age groups from age 5 to 90, that we've certified through not only emotional battery tests, but cognitive emotional battery tests to say, this type of brainwave pattern is what we see with somebody with no diagnosed, no dysfunction that we can diagnose.
Right.
So all of that information is put into the database. So when a clinic is doing QEEGs in their office, they're able to then take their client's recorded brain activity, they upload it to our normative database, and then through a series of complex algorithms, that brain activity is compared to the norm group of their age range. And then in return, what we get is kind of like a weather map. It just shows us areas of the brain and all these separate frequencies, delta, theta, alpha, and beta, of what would be considered to be a normal range for that age, what may be excessively high in power, what might be low in power. And it's those highs and lows in powers that we can see causing, the symptoms that client may be having issues with.
Right. So then the clinician gets this information. They get this very colorful brain map, and there's different kinds. The Loretta maps go deeper on the back of the head, and the obviously some of the other maps go much deeper into the brain. But this is a surface level, and it gives us this kind of analog of brain activity. So how do you then fix it? What is the process where a clinician takes this brain map and turns it into neurofeedback sessions?
The nice thing about a normative database, is the way our system works is it's always starting with the areas of the brain that are the farthest away from what we consider normal. So it might be similar to, going to your local doctor and you tell them, I've got a pain here. So they start looking at what's going to be the most obvious reason to cause that pain. And then what are we going to do to treat that specific issue? And we're kind of doing the same thing in the field of neurofeedback, where we're looking at these QEEGs, we're looking at what's the most abnormal thing we're seeing in this brain activity. And then we're using neurofeedback to guide them back. And that neurofeedback process is basically where, like you said, using some conductive paste, some goopy paste, we're sticking sensors in over certain areas of the brain. And then it's a very passive process. Our client would sit in front of a computer screen. They're going to be watching a movie generally. And as they watch that movie, the software is monitoring what their brain activity is doing. And we've programmed the software to say, we want to increase certain frequency ranges, like maybe delta or theta or alpha, or we want to decrease those. So as the software monitors their brain activity, we're giving them feedback. So that feedback comes in form of changing the brightness of the movie. So I think a lot of the listeners out there probably heard about Pavlov's study with his dogs.
Right.
Operant conditioning. The process neurofeedback uses is exactly the same. We reward the brain when it's doing what we would like it to do. We're taking that reward away when it goes back into an unhealthy pattern. And over time, the brain learns to change its patterns to something that's more healthy. And as that happens, we generally hear from our clients that they're starting to feel better. Symptoms are starting to decrease. And that process is generally repeated for about 30 to 40 sessions in most cases to get somebody back to a state that they're happy with.
Nice. Our feedback from patients is they don't like it when the music or when the volume and the picture fade away. So the brain does not like that. So the brain like subconsciously like goes in and tries to correct that signal. And it's kind of fun because especially the people who don't think there's a change, perception is difficult because it's such a slow process, but they don't notice something, but the rest of the people in their family do, and then that guy's like, oh, I could always think clearly and my judgment was always fine and my memory was fine, and everyone's like, oh my God, so what we found is that the gradualness evaded some people, but the end result didn't. The other thing that I think is amazing about this technology is you can see what's going on in a session, so a good practitioner can say, I want to see these two lines converge, and he can actually see that he's doing it. And then patient frustration levels can be monitored, and you can alter that depending on, pretty much how much you want to challenge the person or what's going on. What is the most difficult you've seen people, you can't say cure these days because God forbid any of us should ever cure anything, but what's the most dramatic, spontaneous remission you've ever seen with this technology? Probably a few things.
Yeah, and I can talk about a few. There's a generalized case of gentleman who had suffered a massive stroke. He was bound to a wheelchair. He couldn't feed himself, couldn't walk, had to be taken care of by his wife. He went through, now granted, this is a very complex case. He went through about a year of neurofeedback at a clinic in Florida.
Right.
And over that year process, was able to regain all function, motor function, speech, to the point where we had actually had a training class down in Florida for new clinics. And we noticed this older gentleman had walked into the room. Nobody recognized him. And as he walked up to the podium, he introduced himself to Dr. Suter.
Right.
And he just said, I drove myself here today to personally thank you. And he told us his story, to see somebody come from a position, that they're potentially going to waste away in a wheelchair or bedridden for the rest of their life.
Right.
To going through some series of brain re-education to just kind of teach the brain after suffering something so traumatic.
Right.
And being able to bounce back on its own. I also, my wife, suffered from depression for decades, multiple medications to manage it. And in her case, we did a combination of some post-traumatic stress work and standard neurofeedback. And I saw her come back from a state of severe clinical depression to what we would consider, quote unquote, normal. All medications were taken off. We titrated pretty quick with her, and she handled it very well. And then, even cases of autistic children coming from a state of, very low function, up to a point of, high function where they can actually now start expressing emotions to their parents. And, all of a sudden the parent makes this comment of, there's my child,
Right.
there's that child that's been hidden behind this veil for years that's now emerging. And I mean, and the stories can go on and on and on, but
yeah,
it
gives you chills. It's got to be the silver lining, so by doing cutting edge medicine, by doing things that are this far ahead of the pack, there's a lot of criticism, there's a lot of pushback. But one of the things, and we get this in regenerative medicine all the time with stem cells, is that we can fix our own families. And, you look at it and you just go, wait a minute, I'm 70 and my wife is 65. Let's compare, and just see how we're doing. I had a post-concussive state that was pretty severe with reflex sympathetic dystrophy. And this is what I did, intranasal stem cells, which is something I like for brains. But then I did the neurofeedback, the brain scan and the neurofeedback. And one point when we were doing a lot of it, I said, no one has ever met themselves and no one has ever met another person until they do QEEG. That you just cannot understand the basics of how your brain is operating. And I've done a lot of work, the right brain, left brain. I have a degree in, quantitative analysis, and hypothetically, my left brain works really well. When I did my brain scan, it said it didn't work at all. And, I never would have gotten there. And so now I was like, oh no, longitudinal level of the lesion. I know where the problem is now. Fix my left brain. And, coincidentally, it made the emotional part of life much easier. And I love this because we're in a world where there's so much guesswork and there's so much overlay of individual attitudes and whatever. And my father was a psychiatrist in the last part of his life. And I look at that and what they were doing 50 years ago with basically biochemistry and a lot of stereotypical kind of like designations of behavior in people. And I just was like, oh my God, my front desk can now do a neuropsychological assessment that's superior to what they could do. And then, it begs the question, like, why hasn't this technology just taken off? Why isn't every psychiatrist, every psychologist, every single person in this industry, like, why isn't it part and parcel, just the same way we'd use a stethoscope or a stem cell or a piece of rehab equipment? Why doesn't that industry embrace this technology?
I mean, I can give you my opinion on it. And, that opinion is, I think it comes down that we don't have lobbyists that are working on behalf of the neurofeedback community, sitting in Washington, trying to explain to everyone that, is building the laws, especially in the medical community, to say, yes, this is, a good approach. This is viable. It's backed in research. It's getting its footings. American Journal of Pediatrics marked neurofeedback as a level 1 treatment for ADD.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Then, we've seen it out here and there, in the media. There's the neurofeedback community as a whole. We're kind of this small subset, and we really don't have the backing like the big pharmacy does. So
sure.
That kind of goes where a lot of conditions are just managed with medication,
right?
Versus looking at the root cause, and that's, kind of NewMind's approach now is, we're really into this functional neurofeedback. We're looking not only at the brain, but we're looking at body, realizing that, the two play this intricate dance together.
Sure.
Sure. And of course, your clinic, you guys knew that, you followed that approach, that biopsychosocial, and I think as time goes on, neurofeedback will gain more and more interest, and more, people like you and I can sit and talk about it and, expose people in the world to, what its potentials are. I think it will make, huge leaps and bounds over the next probably 2 decades. But it's just getting people to understand that, and maybe it's this, a lot of things I've heard in my career in neurofeedback is this is voodoo. This is, this isn't real. So it's getting rid of those misconceptions, that, it's hocus pocus medicine. No, it's backed in research. And, you can go back to Barry Sturman in the 70s, discovering that, adjusting what we call the sensory motor rhythm had the potentials of lowering the intensity and frequency of epileptic seizures. We're not going to say it cured people with epilepsy, but in some cases, it got those people completely off their medication and seizure free. So it's just, I think, a matter of educating,
Clearly, one of the things that we're seeing, this is sort of a microcosm of the bigger picture in functional medicine. There isn't great knowledge, and the people that are assessing the new technology are the ones that own the old technology or no technology. So when we go up against that inertia block, it's really, really difficult. And then, a lot of times it's the kiss of death was it's not scientific. And now we're going, wait a minute, here's the bundle of science supporting this. And where's the bundle of science supporting the current, scope of practice? And there isn't one. And so they've got history on their side, but they don't really have very much else. So as I get into my old age, I actually think that the answer at this point is political. I'm as much of a staunch individualist as anybody, but I actually think that it's the Hannah Arendt, power is the ability to coordinate. And I think one of the things that I'm personally working on is rewriting the scope of practice for generalized medicine. That we need this middle person who is an informed generalist who actually knows some stuff and takes responsibility. And then we have these side protocols where it's not, I give it to a neurologist, but I literally give it to someone to do neurofeedback. Because the neurologist is going to, diagnose a pituitary tumor or give you Neurontin. He's not going to do very much else other than that. And we already know this. We know when we send people down that pathway, it's going to be talk therapy or, what was wrong with your childhood. I'm finding most people's childhood problems go away after we fix the rest of their problems. I think it's a correlative, not a causal thing. And I think we went way too far down that kind of road. Not that it doesn't exist. Everything has a piece. But if I look at kind of the pieces that, if I was going to make a perfect clinic, like we're getting an invitation to maybe set up a clinic in St. Thomas. So we're looking at saying, okay, so how do you improve infant mortality? How do you make the people, how do you address autoimmunity? How do you fix orthopedic problems? How do you make sure people don't die of heart attacks? And then how do you make sure the neuropsych part is in place? Well, you would do a brain scanned, so meaning a test that goes across the population and see what was there. You would head off so many problems, it's not funny. Take out gluten and dairy, do the regen on the orthopedics and the rest of the stuff. You probably just fixed a population. And I'm looking at it and going, okay, that took me 2 minutes to say. It'll take 50 years to implement, and a lot because, you go into a regular person, just take a cocktail party in Los Gatos and say any of the things you and I are saying now, and you'll just close the room down because there's so little information in the existing medical community. And so it's still frustrating, hard. My wife still wonders why we never make it to the end of cocktail parties. But, it's still frustrating and hard that there's so little information and so much misinformation. You have a very, patient and, kind of appropriate, long-term view. And that's what I think you have to have. On the people point of view, it's really frustrating sometimes to go, if your mom has Alzheimer's and, we fix the autoimmune concomitants and then we do neurofeedback with a brain scan, which is going to be really aberrant. It's going to, a person with Alzheimer's or schizophrenia or ADD or any of the neurocognitive neurodegenerative diseases is going to show a very bad brain scan, and it's pretty easy to fix. Then, you're going to go through that. And then we like regenerative medicine as a, like that's got to be a gift from the universe. So we were doing intranasal stem cells for Alzheimer's patients with the neurofeedback and had the same experience as you. The patient showed up in my clinic fully, dressed to the nines and had her hair done and her nails done. And I didn't recognize her. I had treated her for 2 months. It was a different person sitting there. And so these are the mini miracles, and regular medicine doesn't like any kind of miracles because everything should be, one step at a time. But the reality is these are reproducible results. What would you say, in terms of the industry, there seemed to be a consolidation, I don't know if it consolidated or, if it coincided with COVID or whatever, but it seems like a lot of people in the industry aren't there anymore. So is that because it's a lot of small players and, whatever, and there isn't this industry presence you've talked about, or what's going on that, like if I go to buy a neurofeedback unit right now, QEG, there's 50% less vendors than there was 15 years ago when I first did it.
Yeah, and it was, I think what happened, COVID, yes, that was a big part of it. And a lot of companies manufacturing neurofeedback equipment weren't forward thinking enough to kind of anticipate the need that, potentially you weren't going to be able to have a client in your office for whatever reason that may be. Maybe it's a psych patient, that, can't leave their house.
Right.
Maybe it's a massive pandemic that, people don't want to get out because they're afraid they're going to, catch a disease and hurt themselves or hurt, a family member. The company I work for, NewMind, maybe it was luck, maybe it was good thinking, but it was about a year before the pandemic. We put in place a full neurofeedback home training program, which, kind of prior to that, a lot of home training came in the form of photic light and binaural beats, not actual neurofeedback, but just something that could guide brain activity. And with NewMind, our home training system allowed our clinics to still administer full neurofeedback training sessions on their clients, even in the midst of, a raging pandemic that lasted, for a couple of years. So thankfully for us as a company and our customers, we were able to make it through the pandemic. We saw very little clinics that utilize our equipment suffer. And in actuality, there was a lot of clinics that actually grew their practice during the pandemic.
Nice.
Just because they could make this process so easy for a client. They didn't have to drive 2 hours to a clinic or an hour to clinic twice a week.
Right.
They could sit at home in their pajamas. They could do their session. And I think that's some of, the equipment manufacturers and clinics that didn't make it and aren't around today were just due to that fact that, because for years neurofeedback had to be done in an office, in a clinical setting.
Sure.
The patients had to drive, they had to be there, and then you get a state or government that says you have to close your clinic because you're non-essential.
Right.
And unfortunately, I heard that, and especially in the chiropractic community, there was a few specific states that deemed chiropractic as a non-essential modality. Right. And therefore, they had to close their practice temporarily, which means, they lost all their clientele. And, whether or not they came back was a whole nother story.
Yeah, so we're a medical clinic. So we've got, 2 MDs, an osteopath, 2 nurse practitioners, a bunch of medical people. My original training is chiropractic, but I haven't done that in probably 10 years. But we ended up not being forced to, sort of being invited to do the telehealth thing. And I mean, at this point in our both sides of our clinic, we've got 6 different Zoom stations. It's like, it's as big from a patient facing point of view as the rest of our clinic. And, and so in 8,000 square feet, 2,000 of it is set up to talk to people from distance. In some of this stuff, like advanced diagnostics, I need to look at the person. Like I've had patients that showed big screens from India and showed the guy, he walked in and I was like, hemochromatosis, like I had him just like that. I can't do that on a screen, but you can do neurofeedback on a screen. And, that's such a great idea. And then there is so much setup and so much of that. I love the home units in the day. I thought the thing that worked was you do a brain scan in the clinic and then you send the person out home with the home unit. And it was something the patient could own. It was $2,000 or $3,000. It was not over the top. And a lot of these people, especially in California, we get these people that are, they're really kind of in a place they can't get here. Like hypothetically, as the crow drives or flies, it's an hour away, but it's really 3 hours away in traffic. And then when COVID happened, they just weren't going to do it. So we did almost all our biochemistry, over the phone or over the TV. And now I'm looking at this technology and go, you guys figured out the telehealth thing. And, that's just going to be something, I think it was a necessity in the COVID world, but I think it's great. I think it's really a thing that people can, it's much more respectful of patient times. And actually it's more respectful of doctor times. And clinic times. I find that when people schedule a thing, you're going to have a very productive 20, 40-minute session, whatever that thing is. A lot of times they come in with a specific agenda. They're not anxious because they had, no lunch or traffic or whatever the thing is. We, especially in kids, we found, sometimes we'd have to feed them before we did the neurofeedback sessions and, that kind of thing. So I think that's really a great thing. Do you guys does your company have a completely kind of at-home solution? What's that look like?
Yeah, I would say it's about 95% at this point. We're actually working with a piece of technology right now where we're looking at being able to do actually a modified mini queue in a home setting.
Wow. Yeah.
So it's a wireless style headset. It's running dry sensors, so the client at home wouldn't need to worry about, the electrode gel, which is just the conductive medium we use to monitor that with a QEEG cap. So it'd be a dry cap they would put on. It interfaces with our software. It gives us enough image of the brain where we can see what's dysregulated. Of course, it's not going to be anything to the extent of what we would do in an office or what you would have done in a hospital setting. But it's enough where we can pick up the major areas of the brain. We can read all those frequencies you and I have talked about up till now. So that's kind of the next evolution. And once that comes online, we'll be able to pretty much be 100% telehealth, where a clinic could box this unit up. They could send it off FedEx to the client. Mm-hmm. A few steps, walk them through, helping them get that linked up to the equipment via Wi-Fi. And then the client just needs to put it on. The clinic could remotely record their brain activity.
Nice.
And then they could send it back. And from that point, the clinic can then just look at the activity they see, start designing a treatment regimen, mm-hmm. and then build those protocols, and then the client can easily, run those sessions. And, with us, our big thing has always been, we are a company that's, built by clinicians for clinicians. So we understand, in a clinical setting, doctors, their staff, they want something that's simple and easy to use. And we made sure of that in our home training to where, when a client does this remotely at home, it's literally about 4 clicks of a mouse and they're in the middle of a session running. Try to make it absolutely as easy as possible. So to answer your question, we're 95% tele right now. Mm-hmm. Probably within the next 3 to 6 months, we'll be able to do full 100% at home, where a client never would have to come into our clinic. They can do all their surveys, their progress trackers, all that biopsycho social approach that we incorporate. And then administer the neurofeedback accordingly to what we see.
I think that's really fantastic progress. About 8 years ago, I wrote a comic book, medical information being controlled by, these cartels and all this kind of stuff. And it was just sort of a doodle until after COVID, all of it came true. And so I'm sort of like doing a thing. So I wrote a thing on neurofeedback, and that is that you could have a helmet that you put on a dog and prove that the dog's brain waves were the same as your brain waves. That's one of my theories in life. I look at my German Shepherd and I look at my Bulldog and I look at him and I go, I'm pretty sure they're thinking exactly what I'm thinking. So one of the things that this technology allows us to do, if we got some big acrylic helmet that would just be easy to put on a dog, you could do that without the diodes. It sounds like you guys are making progress. But at the same time, that's kind of what we need for people. We need it to be not complicated. It can't be, the 1020 map over the head with all that stuff. Then you can't do it on yourself anyway. But I think at the point where we get something that's an easy apparatus that just goes over a head, like a football helmet or something, and then we do that thing, and we kind of get away from our level, I think there's a trade-off in our level of specificity, so we don't want to get it to where we're not getting we're not getting enough information to act, but we don't really need as much as we're getting as in a regular brain scan. I think if we can sort of gently move toward that side, and I know all the dog lovers would really love it. So, that's you can put on your to-do list. Yeah. So, Erin, it's been a pleasure. It's so good to see you again it's been a while. And I wish you guys all the luck. We're going to put Erin and his contact information, his company information on the link, and we'll put it on our site. And then anyone interested in more information, you can either contact us or you can contact Erin directly, and we can, see about getting neurofeedback in your life. So again, thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Santucci. Take care, everyone.
Take care. Thanks for listening to the Medical Insider podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure you visit medicalinsider.com. Go ahead and sign up for these episodes. Get them sent directly to your inbox. Do us a favor and give us a like.